The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Julesburg, Colorado territory, as Darius Keller squinted at the distant plume of smoke rising from the approaching train. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, fidgeted with the brim of his hat. This was the day his mail-order bride was set to arrive, a woman he knew only through carefully penned letters, and a small daguerreotype that showed a pretty face with serious eyes. The year was 1872, and Julesburg had grown since the railroad had come through. Still, it remained a rough frontier town, with more saloons than churches and more cowboys than proper ladies. Darius had tired of the loneliness that came with his moderately successful cattle ranch, 10 miles outside of town. At 32, he decided it was time to find a wife, and after his friend's success with a mail-order bride, he'd placed an advertisement in a Boston newspaper. Margaret Calloway had responded. Her letters were thoughtful and well-written, speaking of her desire to leave behind the crowded confines of the city for a new life in the West. She was 26, educated, and by her own admission, not the type to find a husband easily in Boston society. "I am too opinionated for most men's taste," she had written, "but I believe that quality might serve me well on the frontier." Darius had liked her honesty. They had exchanged letters for 6 months before he had sent her the money for train passage, and now she was arriving. The train whistle blew loudly as it pulled into the station, steam billowing around the engine. Darius straightened his tie, a rare concession to formality, and stepped forward as passengers began to disembark. He searched the faces of the few women who stepped down, looking for the auburn-haired woman from the photograph when the last passenger had departed, and there was no sign of Margaret. Darius approached the conductor. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm expecting a woman from Boston, Margaret Calloway." The conductor's face grew serious. "You'd be Mr. Keller then. She's still aboard. Took ill about 2 days back, been running a high fever since Denver. We almost left her there, but she insisted she could make it to Julesburg." Darius felt his stomach tighten with worry. "Where is she?" The conductor led him to a rear passenger car where a woman lay across 2 seats, a small valise serving as her pillow. Her face was flushed, her breathing labored, and her dress was wrinkled from travel. Despite this, Darius recognized her from the photograph: the high cheekbones, the straight nose, the determined set of her jaw. "Miss Calloway." Darius knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a striking blue that the daguerreotype hadn't captured. "Mr. Keller." Her voice was weak, but she attempted to sit up. "I apologize for not being more presentable." "Don't worry about that now," he said, placing a hand on her forehead. It was burning hot. "We need to get you to a doctor." "No doctor in Julesburg right now," the conductor interjected. "Old Doc Wilson went to Denver for supplies. Won't be back for a week." Darius frowned. "Then I'll take her to my ranch. I can send for the doctor in Sterling if need be." With gentle hands, he lifted Margaret from the seat. She was lighter than he expected, and she weakly protested the indignity. "Mr. Keller, this is hardly proper." "Propriety can wait, Miss Calloway. You're ill, and I aim to see you well." He carried her off the train, aware of the curious stares from the townsfolk. Julesburg might be small, but gossip traveled faster than telegraph messages. By sundown, everyone would know that Darius Keller's mail-order bride had arrived sick as a dog, and he'd carried her off like a scene from a dime novel. Darius had brought his wagon into town, expecting to transport Margaret and her belongings back to the ranch in relative comfort. Now he improvised, creating a makeshift bed in the back with blankets he'd brought along. "Samuel," he called to a young boy watching nearby, "run and fetch Mrs. Langford. Tell her I need her to come out to the ranch. It's an emergency." The boy nodded and took off, running toward the general store, where Mrs. Langford, the closest thing Julesburg had to a nurse, worked as a clerk. As Darius carefully arranged Margaret in the wagon, she caught his wrist with a surprisingly strong grip. "I truly am sorry," she whispered. "This is not how I imagined our meeting." Darius smiled down at her, tucking a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. Nor I, but we'll get through this. Rest now. The journey to the ranch was slow and careful, with Darius avoiding every rut and hole in the road to spare Margaret any unnecessary jostling. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring about Boston or calling for her mother. By the time they arrived at his modest but well-built home, the sun was beginning to set, painting the prairie in golds and purples. Darius carried Margaret inside and laid her on his own bed, the only proper one in the house. He had built a small room off the main cabin in anticipation of her arrival, but it wasn't yet furnished. He'd planned for them to marry quickly and then purchase proper furnishings together, allowing her to make the house her own. Now he dampened a cloth with cool water from the bucket by the stove and placed it on her forehead. Her eyes opened again, clearer this time. "Where am I?" "My ranch, about 10 miles outside Julesburg." She attempted to sit up, then fell back with a groan. "I should not be in your bed, Mr. Keller. It's not right." "Don't fret about that now. Mrs. Langford should be here soon. She's a respectable widow who'll stay with us for propriety's sake until you're well." Margaret nodded weakly, then closed her eyes again. Darius continued to bathe her face with the cool cloth, worry etching lines around his eyes. He was no doctor, but he'd seen fevers before. Some were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Others could take a strong man down in days. And Margaret, though possessing a clear inner strength, was already weakened from her long journey. An hour passed before he heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Darius went outside to find Mrs. Langford, a stout woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes, climbing down from her buckboard. "Where is she?" Mrs. Langford asked, all business as she gathered her bag, inside. "She's been feverish since Denver, according to the conductor." Mrs. Langford nodded and followed him into the house. She approached Margaret, her experienced hands checking her pulse, feeling her forehead and listening to her breathing. "Likely influenza," she pronounced. "Been cases in Denver. We'll need to keep her cool, make sure she drinks plenty of water and watch for signs of worsening." She turned to Darius. "You did right to bring me out here. A young, unmarried woman under your roof alone would set tongues wagging something fierce, even in these circumstances." "I appreciate you coming, Mrs. Langford. I'll stay the night. We'll need to keep the fever down. Heat some water. We'll make willow bark tea. It helps with the fever." Darius moved to the stove, grateful for something practical to do. As he worked, he glanced frequently at Margaret's still form on the bed. This was not how he'd imagined their first day together. In his mind, they would have had an awkward but hopeful meeting, followed by a quick ceremony with the local minister, and then a pleasant dinner at the hotel before bringing her home as his wife. Instead, he was boiling willow bark and praying that the woman he'd asked to share his life wouldn't die before they'd had a chance to truly meet. The night was long. Mrs. Langford took the first watch, sitting beside Margaret with a cool cloth and a gentle voice, encouraging her to sip water or tea whenever she woke. Around midnight, Darius relieved her, settling into the chair by the bed. In the quiet darkness, lit only by a single oil lamp turned low, Margaret seemed both stronger and more vulnerable. Her fever still raged, but her breathing was steadier. Darius took the cloth, dipped it in fresh, cool water and placed it on her forehead. She stirred at his touch, "Mr. Keller." Her voice was a rasp. "Yes, I'm here. I think I should go back to Boston." Her blue eyes were glassy with fever but determined. This was a mistake. Darius felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "Don't make decisions now, Miss Calloway. Wait until you're well." She shook her head weakly. "I'm bringing you nothing but trouble, and you deserve better than a sickly wife." "You're not sickly," he said firmly. "You're sick. There's a difference. One passes, the other doesn't." A ghost of a smile touched her lips before she drifted back to sleep. Darius continued his vigil, replacing the cloth whenever it grew warm, speaking softly to her when she became restless, and trying not to think about the possibility of her returning east before they'd even had a chance. Dawn brought no improvement. If anything, Margaret seemed worse, her breathing more labored, her skin hotter to the touch despite their efforts. Mrs. Langford's face grew grave as she examined her. "We need to break this fever," she said. "I've seen influenza take strong men in days, given her condition after the long journey." She didn't need to finish the thought. Darius felt cold fear grip his heart. "What can we do? Cold baths can help bring down a dangerous fever, but—" Mrs. Langford hesitated. "It would hardly be proper." Darius ran a hand through his hair. "Propriety be damned if it will save her life." Mrs. Langford nodded, her expression solemn. "I'll need your help carrying water. We'll use the washtub." They worked quickly, filling the metal tub with cool water from the well. When it was ready, Mrs. Langford turned to Darius. "You'll need to wait outside." "Of course." He moved toward the door, then paused. Will you need help moving her?" Mrs. Langford considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "I can't lift her alone, but once she's in the tub, you must leave." Darius agreed, and together they carefully lifted Margaret, still fully clothed, and placed her in the tub. The shock of the cool water roused her briefly, her eyes flying open in confusion and fear. "It's all right," Darius said quickly. "This will help bring down your fever." As promised, he left immediately after, pacing outside on the porch, anxiety gnawing at him. Through the open window, he could hear Mrs. Langford's gentle murmurings and Margaret's occasional weak protests. After what seemed an eternity, Mrs. Langford called him back inside. Margaret was back in bed, now dressed in a simple white nightgown that must have come from her valise. Her hair was damp and her face less flushed, but she was shivering violently. "The cold bath helped lower the fever, Mrs. Langford explained, "but we need to be careful she doesn't catch a chill now. Keep her covered, but continue with the cool cloths on her forehead. I need to return to town for more supplies, but I'll be back before nightfall." After Mrs. Langford departed, Darius resumed his place beside Margaret. The house felt oddly quiet without the older woman's practical presence. He adjusted the blankets, making sure Margaret was warm but not overheated, and placed a fresh, cool cloth on her brow. As he sat watching over her, he found himself studying her face. In repose, with the fever's flush somewhat abated, he could see the woman from the photograph more clearly: the straight nose, the well-defined cheekbones, the stubborn chin. But there was more that the picture hadn't captured. The small freckles across her nose, the way her eyelashes curled slightly at the ends, the tiny scar near her right temple. "You're staring, Mr. Keller." Darius started at the sound of her voice. Margaret's eyes were open, and while still bright with fever, they seemed more lucid than before. "Forgive me," he said. "I was just getting to know your face." A faint smile touched her lips. "And what have you learned?" "That you're even prettier than your photograph suggested." She closed her eyes briefly. Flattery to a woman who looks like death warmed over. "You're either very kind or very determined, perhaps a bit of both." He offered her a sip of water, which she accepted gratefully. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted. "But I think the fever might be a touch lower." "The bath seems to have helped. Mrs. Langford will be back this evening with more supplies." Margaret nodded, then looked away, a flush that had nothing to do with fever coloring her cheeks. Was it you who?" Understanding her concern, Darius quickly reassured her. Mrs. Langford attended to everything of a personal nature. "I only helped move you to the tub, and I left immediately after." Relief washed over her face. "Thank you for your discretion." "Of course." He paused, then added softly, "I want you to know, Miss Calloway, that while our circumstances are unusual, I intend to behave as a gentleman in all respects." She met his eyes then, holding his gaze with surprising strength for someone so ill. "I never doubted that, Mr. Keller. Your letters revealed a man of integrity." They fell silent for a moment, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the occasional call of a meadowlark outside. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "Tell me about your ranch. In your letters, you mentioned cattle but little else." Darius was grateful for the change in subject. "It's not large by Colorado standards, about 500 acres. I run about 200 head of cattle, mostly Herefords." There's good water from the creek that runs along the western boundary, and the grass grows sweet here. The house is small, as you can see, but I built it solid. I was planning to expand it once." He trailed off, suddenly aware that their future together was far from certain. "Once you had a wife," Margaret finished for him. "That makes sense. There's a small orchard behind the house, apple and cherry trees. They're still young, but they produced their first fruit last summer, and there's a kitchen garden. I'm not much of a gardener, so it's fairly basic. Just potatoes, beans, corn, and some tomatoes." "It sounds lovely," she said, her voice growing weaker. "I always wanted a garden. In Boston, we had only a small yard, and my father preferred it to be ornamental rather than practical. When you're well, you can plant whatever you like." Darius realized he was already speaking as though she would stay, as though their plans remained unchanged despite her earlier talk of returning to Boston. Margaret didn't correct him, though. Her eyes were growing heavy again. "I think I need to rest a bit more, of course." He adjusted the cool cloth on her forehead. "Sleep well, Miss Calloway." As she drifted off, Darius remained by her side, alternating between watching her face and gazing out the window at his land. It was good land, hard-won and cherished, but in the past year he'd begun to realize that land alone couldn't provide the kind of fulfillment he sought. He needed someone to share it with, someone who would see its beauty as he did, who would help make his house into a home. In their correspondence, Margaret had seemed like she might be that person. She had written of her dreams for a different kind of life, away from the constraints of Boston society. She had asked intelligent questions about ranching and the challenges of frontier life. She had even confessed to practicing her bread-making skills, determined not to arrive completely unprepared for her new role. Now, watching her struggle against illness far from home, Darius felt a protective instinct rising within him that went beyond mere obligation or propriety. Whether she decided to stay or return to Boston once recovered, he was determined to see her well again. The day passed slowly. Margaret slept fitfully, occasionally waking long enough to take sips of water or willow bark tea. Each time Darius was there, his presence steady and reassuring. He spoke to her of small things: the weather, the antics of a mother fox and her kits near the creek, the progress of the garden. His voice seemed to soothe her, and she would often drift back to sleep with the ghost of a smile on her lips. In between tending to Margaret, Darius managed to care for his most essential ranch duties. His nearest neighbor, Thomas Wilson, had agreed to check on his cattle while Darius was in town, but there were still the horses to feed and water, and the chickens to tend to. Each time he left the house, he worked with swift efficiency, eager to return to Margaret's side. Late in the afternoon, when the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, Margaret woke more fully. She struggled to sit up, and Darius quickly moved to help her, arranging pillows behind her back. "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger than it had been. "I think I would like to try some food if there's anything available." Encouraged by this sign of improvement, Darius nodded. "I have some chicken broth simmering. Mrs. Langford suggested it would be gentle on your stomach." He brought her a cup of the broth, sitting beside her as she sipped it carefully. Color was returning to her cheeks, though whether from the fever or improved health, he couldn't be sure. "This is good," she said after a few sips. "Did you make it?" "Yes," he admitted. "Though the recipe is my mother's. She was from Virginia originally and believed a good broth could cure almost anything. She sounds like a wise woman, is she?" "She passed 5 years ago. My father 2 years before that. They came west with me when I was 18, helped me establish the ranch. They lived to see it become successful, at least." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "My own parents are gone as well. My father died 3 years ago, a heart ailment. My mother followed 6 months later. The doctors said it was pneumonia, but I think it was grief. They were very devoted to one another." "I'm sorry for your loss," Darius said softly. "It must have been difficult losing them both so close together." "It was. That's partly why I decided to come west. Our house in Boston held too many memories, and without my parents, there was little to keep me there." My older brother inherited the house and business, and while he would have let me stay on, his wife and I never got along particularly well. She took another sip of broth, her hands steadier now. Besides, I've always been drawn to the idea of the frontier, the openness, the possibility. In Boston, everyone knows exactly who you are and what your place is. Here it seems like you can become whoever you choose to be. That's true to some extent, Darius agreed, though the frontier has its own expectations and challenges. Of course, I didn't mean to sound naive. I know life out here is hard. Your letters made that clear. She gave him a small smile. I appreciated your honesty about the difficulties. Too many advertisements paint the West as some sort of paradise, with no mention of blizzards, drought, or isolation. Darius returned her smile. I figured you deserved to know what you were getting into. Though I certainly didn't anticipate you'd face your first challenge before even reaching the ranch. Margaret's smile faded slightly. I still feel terrible about this. You've been so kind, Mr. Keller, but this isn't what you signed up for. Nor is it what you signed up for, he countered gently. But life rarely goes according to plan, especially out here. We adapt. Before Margaret could respond, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. A few minutes later, Mrs. Langford bustled in, her arms full of supplies. Well now, look who's sitting up, she exclaimed, her face brightening at the sight of Margaret. That's a good sign indeed. She set her bundles down and approached the bed, placing a practiced hand on Margaret's forehead. Still warm, but much improved from this morning. Let me check your pulse. After a thorough examination, Mrs. Langford declared that Margaret was on the mend, though not out of danger yet. The fever could spike again, especially at night. We'll need to continue with the cool compresses and the willow bark tea, but I think the worst has passed. She turned to Darius. I've brought more medicinal supplies, as well as some clean linens and a nightgown of my own that should fit Miss Calloway. The poor girl can't keep wearing the same garment day and night. Darius thanked her profusely, relieved by both her practical assistance and her reassurance about Margaret's condition. Mrs. Langford waved off his gratitude. It's what neighbors do out here, she said simply. Now, I've also brought some food. Let me fix us all some supper, and then we can settle in for the night. I'll stay again, of course. As Mrs. Langford moved efficiently around the small kitchen, Darius helped Margaret finish her broth. He couldn't help but notice that despite her illness, there was a natural grace to her movements, a quiet dignity that commanded respect. She caught him watching her again and raised an eyebrow. Still studying my face, Mr. Keller, he smiled, not embarrassed at being caught this time. I'm just glad to see you looking better. You had me worried. Had myself worried too, she admitted quietly. I've never been so ill before. Well, you're showing your strength now. Mrs. Langford thinks you're improving, thanks to your care. She hesitated, then added softly, and your presence. It helped having you here, talking to me. Even when I was too weak to respond, I could hear your voice. It was comforting. Darius felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest at her words. I'm glad. I wasn't sure if I was helping or just babbling like a fool. Definitely helping, she assured him with a small smile that transformed her face, giving him a glimpse of the vibrant woman beneath the illness. Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Langford announcing that supper was ready. Darius helped Margaret adjust her position and placed a tray across her lap. The meal was simple, a hearty stew Mrs. Langford had brought, fresh bread, and apple preserves, but it was exactly what was needed. Margaret managed only a few spoonfuls of stew before tiring, but Mrs. Langford seemed pleased with even this small progress. Your appetite will return gradually, she assured her. The important thing is to keep taking fluids. After the meal, Mrs. Langford shooed Darius outside while she helped Margaret change into the clean nightgown. When he was allowed back in, Margaret was settled against fresh pillows, her hair neatly braided, looking noticeably more comfortable. I'm going to make up a bed for myself in that new room you built, Mrs. Langford told Darius. You should get some proper rest tonight. I'll keep an eye on our patient. Darius nodded gratefully. He hadn't slept properly since Margaret's arrival, and exhaustion was beginning to catch up with him. "Wake me if there's any change," he instructed before bidding them both good night. He made a bed for himself on the floor of the main room, not wanting to be too far from Margaret in case she needed anything. Despite his fatigue, sleep was elusive. His mind kept returning to Margaret, her quiet strength, the way her eyes lit up when she smiled, her gracious acceptance of his care despite the awkwardness of their situation. In their letters, he had developed a respect for her intelligence and character. Now, seeing her in person, even in such difficult circumstances, he found himself increasingly drawn to her. There was a resilience about her that resonated with him, a quality essential for survival on the frontier. But he reminded himself that her future plans remained uncertain. She had spoken of returning to Boston when first feverish, and while she hadn't mentioned it again, the possibility hung between them, unaddressed. It would be foolish to let his heart become too invested before knowing her intentions. With these thoughts circling in his mind, Darius eventually drifted into a restless sleep. He was awakened sometime in the night by Mrs. Langford's urgent voice. "Mr. Keller, wake up, the fever's spiking again." Instantly alert, Darius scrambled to his feet and followed Mrs. Langford into the bedroom. Margaret was thrashing weakly against the covers, her face flushed crimson, her hair damp with sweat. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she was murmuring incoherently. "We need another cold bath," Mrs. Langford said grimly. "This fever's fighting back hard." Together they filled the tub again, working quickly and efficiently. Like before, Darius helped move Margaret to the tub, then left while Mrs. Langford attended to her. This time, however, he couldn't bring himself to go outside. He paced the main room, anxiety gnawing at his insides. Mrs. Langford's voice called from the bedroom. "Mr. Keller, I need your help. She's having convulsions." Darius rushed in to find Margaret shaking violently in the tub, her eyes rolled back. Without hesitation, he reached into the water and helped Mrs. Langford lift her out, propriety forgotten in the face of emergency. "Wrap her in this sheet," Mrs. Langford instructed, handing him a damp piece of cloth. "We need to keep her cool but get her out of the tub." They laid Margaret on the bed, wrapped in the damp sheet. Mrs. Langford immediately began bathing her face with cool water, while Darius held her shoulders steady as the convulsions gradually subsided. "Talk to her," Mrs. Langford urged. "She responded to your voice before. It might help bring her back." Swallowing hard against the fear that threatened to choke him, Darius leaned closer to Margaret. "Miss Calloway, Margaret, can you hear me? It's Darius. You're going to be all right. The fever's just spiked again, but we're bringing it down. Stay with us now. Stay with me." For several terrifying minutes, there was no response. Then, slowly, Margaret's eyelids fluttered. She looked up at him, confusion clouding her gaze. "Darius." It was the first time she had used his given name, and despite the circumstances, the sound of it on her lips sent a jolt through him. "I'm here," he said, relief washing over him. "You're going to be fine." Mrs. Langford checked her forehead. "The fever's coming down again, thank the Lord." They continued their vigil through the remainder of the night, taking turns bathing Margaret's face and neck with cool water, encouraging her to sip water or willow bark tea when she was conscious enough to do so. By dawn, the crisis had passed. Margaret slept peacefully, her breathing regular, her skin much cooler to the touch. "She's turned the corner," Mrs. Langford pronounced, exhaustion evident in her voice. "Barring any further complications, I believe she'll recover now." Darius sagged with relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Langford." "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have managed," she said kindly. "You've shown remarkable care for a woman who arrived as a stranger." "She doesn't feel like a stranger," Darius admitted quietly, his gaze returning to Margaret's sleeping form. "Even before she arrived, her letters, I felt I knew her." Mrs. Langford studied him thoughtfully. "Well, now you've seen her at her worst. That's something most couples don't experience until they've been married for years." The older woman's matter-of-fact tone made Darius smile despite his fatigue. "I suppose that's true." I'll stay one more day, Mrs. Langford decided. By tomorrow, if she continues improving, I think you can manage on your own. Though perhaps we should consider having a woman from town come stay, for propriety's sake. Darius nodded. Of course, I want to protect Miss Calloway's reputation. Good man. Mrs. Langford patted his shoulder. Now, why don't you get some rest while she's sleeping peacefully? I'll wake you if there's any change. This time, Darius slept deeply, his body surrendering to exhaustion now that the immediate crisis had passed. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the house. He rose, stretching muscles sore from tension and irregular sleep, and made his way to the kitchen. Mrs. Langford was at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. She glanced up as he entered. "Good morning. You look much better for having slept." "How is she?" Darius asked immediately. "See for yourself." Mrs. Langford nodded toward the bedroom door, which stood partially open. Darius approached cautiously and peered in. Margaret was sitting up against the pillows, her hair neatly combed and braided, wearing the clean nightgown Mrs. Langford had brought. Her face was still pale, but the unhealthy flush was gone, and her eyes were clear and alert as they met his. "Good morning, Mr. Keller," she said, her voice weak but steady. "Good morning." He entered the room fully, relief washing over him at the sight of her improved condition. "You're looking much better." "I'm feeling much better. Mrs. Langford says the fever broke completely in the early morning hours." "It did," Darius confirmed. "You gave us quite a scare last night." A shadow crossed Margaret's face. "I remember parts of it, did I?" She hesitated, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Was I saying things?" "In my delirium," Darius chose his words carefully, "you were mostly incoherent, nothing embarrassing if that's what you're worried about." Relief softened her features. "That's good. I've heard that people in fever dreams can say the most outlandish things." "You did call me Darius once," he admitted. "If that counts as outlandish," her blush deepened. "I'm sorry, that was presumptuous of me." "Not at all." He moved closer to the bed, drawn by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "I'd like it if you called me Darius. After all, we've been through quite an ordeal together already." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Darius, and you may call me Margaret if you wish." "Margaret," he said, testing the name. It felt right on his tongue, natural. "Are you hungry? Mrs. Langford is making breakfast." "Actually, yes. For the first time since I fell ill on the train, I have a proper appetite." "That's an excellent sign." He smiled, genuinely pleased by this evidence of her recovery. "I'll bring you a tray." As he turned to leave, she called after him softly. "Darius," he paused, looking back at her. "Yes, thank you for everything. I know this isn't what you expected when you sent for a bride." The sincerity in her eyes touched him deeply. "Nor is it what you expected when you agreed to come, but we're getting through it." Margaret nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Yes, we are." The day passed peacefully. Margaret continued to improve, managing to eat a light breakfast and later some soup for lunch. Mrs. Langford declared herself satisfied with her patient's progress and announced that she would return to town the following morning. "I've spoken with Mrs. Peterson," she told them over supper, which Margaret was strong enough to take at the table, wrapped in a blanket against any chill. "She's agreed to come stay for a few days for propriety's sake until you decide your next steps." Margaret glanced at Darius, a question in her eyes. He realized they had not yet discussed what would happen once she recovered. The original plan had been for them to marry shortly after her arrival, but her illness had disrupted everything. "Thank you, Mrs. Langford," he said. "That's very thoughtful." After Mrs. Langford retired for the night, Darius and Margaret remained at the table, a comfortable silence between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. "I suppose we should talk about what happens now." Darius nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her gaze. "Yes, I suppose we should." "Our original arrangement." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It was made before we truly knew each other, before I fell ill and complicated everything." "You didn't complicate things on purpose," Darius pointed out. "Illness happens, it's not your fault." No, but it has changed our situation. She took a deep breath. In my fever, I mentioned returning to Boston. I want you to know that was the fever talking, not me. I have no desire to go back east. Relief flooded through him. I'm glad to hear that. But, she continued, I also don't think we should rush into marriage just because that was our initial plan. We've barely had a chance to truly know each other. Darius considered this. Part of him was disappointed he had been preparing himself for a life with Margaret for months now. But another part recognized the wisdom in her words. What do you suggest? He asked. Perhaps a courtship of sorts, a period of time for us to become better acquainted before making a lifelong commitment. She smiled wryly. I know it's rather backward, considering I've already traveled across the country to be your wife, but circumstances have given us this opportunity to approach things differently. Darius found himself nodding. That makes sense, though there's still the matter of propriety. You living here unmarried. Mrs. Peterson can stay for a while, as Mrs. Langford suggested, and perhaps after that I could find lodging in town. I could work at the general store or school to earn my keep until we decide. You don't need to earn your keep, Darius protested. I sent for you. I'm responsible for your well-being. Margaret's chin lifted slightly, a hint of the stubborn independence she had mentioned in her letters. I don't want to be a burden or an obligation, Darius. If we decide not to marry, I want to know I can stand on my own 2 feet. He admired her spirit even as he worried about the practical aspects of her plan. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, you need to recover fully, then we can figure out the rest. She relaxed slightly, nodding. That's fair, one step at a time. As they sat in the warm kitchen, the lamp casting a soft glow over them, Darius found himself studying Margaret again. Despite her illness, or perhaps because of having witnessed her fight through it, he felt a deepening admiration for her. There was a quiet dignity about her, a resilience that matched his own. I should help you back to bed, he said finally. You've been up long enough for your first day out of bed. Margaret didn't protest as he helped her to her feet. She was still weak, and she leaned on his arm as they walked slowly to the bedroom. At the doorway, she paused. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about us having seen each other at our worst already. Darius raised an eyebrow. I didn't say that. Mrs. Langford did. Ah, she smiled. Well, it's true nonetheless. You've seen me delirious with fever, and I've seen you unshaven and exhausted from caring for me. It's not the conventional start to a relationship. No, he agreed, but perhaps it's not the worst start either. There's a certain honesty to it. Her smile deepened, reaching her eyes. Yes, there is. Good night, Darius. Good night, Margaret. The next morning, Mrs. Langford departed after extracting promises from both of them that they would send word immediately if Margaret's condition worsened. Mrs. Peterson, a quiet widow in her early 40s, arrived shortly after with a small trunk of belongings, prepared to stay for at least a week, with Margaret continuing to gain strength daily and Mrs. Peterson handling the cooking and lighter household chores. Darius was able to return to his ranch duties. The cattle had fared well under Thomas Wilson's watchful eye, but there were always tasks requiring attention on a working ranch. In the evenings, he would return to the house to find Margaret usually sitting in a chair on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling air, sometimes reading, sometimes simply watching the sunset over the prairie. They would share supper with Mrs. Peterson, and afterward, while their chaperone busied herself with mending or letter writing, they would talk. These conversations quickly became the highlight of Darius's days. Margaret was indeed opinionated, as she had warned in her letters, but her opinions were thoughtful and well-reasoned. She was curious about every aspect of ranch life, asking intelligent questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. For her part, Margaret seemed equally engaged by their exchanges. She told him more about her life in Boston, her father's bookshop, which she had helped manage, her mother's involvement in the women's suffrage movement, her own passion for literature and history. I brought some books with me, she confessed one evening. more than was probably practical for the journey, but I couldn't bear to leave them behind. I'm glad you brought them, Darius said. There aren't many books in Julesburg, and the ones that do make their way here tend to be dime novels or practical manuals. Do you enjoy reading? She asked. When I have time. My education was fairly limited. We moved west when I was young, but my mother taught me to appreciate good writing. I have a small collection of books myself. Margaret's eyes lit up. May I see them? He led her to a shelf in the corner of the main room where a dozen or so books were carefully arranged. She ran her fingers gently along the spines, reading the titles aloud. Shakespeare's collected works, The Last of the Mohicans, Walden, The Odyssey. She glanced at him with new appreciation. This is an excellent collection for a self-described man of limited education. Darius felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the hearth. My mother believed that education continues long after schooling ends. These were her books originally. I've added a few over the years when I could. She sounds like a remarkable woman. I wish I could have met her. She would have liked you, Darius said with certainty. She always hoped I'd find a woman with both spirit and substance. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of growing feelings, a recognition of possibilities. The moment was broken by Mrs. Peterson discreetly clearing her throat. It's getting late, she remarked mildly. Perhaps we should all retire for the night. The days fell into a pattern. Margaret grew stronger, eventually able to move around the house freely and even take short walks outside with Darius or Mrs. Peterson. She began to help with simple household tasks, insisting that activity was the best medicine for regaining her strength. A week after Mrs. Peterson's arrival, Margaret announced at breakfast that she felt well enough to venture into town. Are you sure? Darius asked, concern evident in his voice. It's a long ride and you're still recovering. I'm much stronger now, she assured him. Besides, I need to thank Mrs. Langford properly for her care and… She hesitated. I should speak with the minister about our situation. Darius understood her meaning immediately. Their original plan had been to marry upon her arrival. Now, with their decision to proceed more cautiously, they needed to explain the change to Reverend Thomas, who had been expecting to perform the ceremony. I'll hitch up the wagon after breakfast, he said. We can make a day of it. There are people in town I'd like you to meet anyway. The journey to Julesburg was taken at a leisurely pace, with frequent stops to allow Margaret to rest. She wore one of the two dresses she had brought with her, a simple blue cotton that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the color of her eyes. Despite the lingering pallor from her illness, Darius thought she had never looked lovelier. Julesburg was busy when they arrived, the main street filled with wagons and riders. It was Saturday, and farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area had come to town for supplies and socializing. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Curious glances and whispers followed them as Darius helped Margaret down from the wagon. Word has spread about your arrival and illness, Darius explained apologetically. News travels fast in small towns. Margaret squared her shoulders. Well, then we should give them something accurate to talk about rather than speculation. Their first stop was the general store where Mrs. Langford worked. The older woman's face lit up at the sight of Margaret walking through the door under her own power. Miss Calloway. Look at you up and about. She hurried around the counter to greet them. You're looking so much better. Thanks to your excellent care, Margaret said warmly, taking Mrs. Langford's hands in her own. I can't thank you enough for what you did for me. Nonsense, Mrs. Langford waved away her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same, but I am glad to see you recovered. Will you be staying in town now, or… Her questioning gaze moved between Margaret and Darius. We're still sorting out the details, Darius answered diplomatically. For now, Mrs. Peterson is staying with us at the ranch while Margaret continues to regain her strength. After purchasing a few supplies and spending some time in conversation with Mrs. Langford, they made their way to the parsonage, beside the small white church at the end of the main street. Reverend Thomas, A kind-faced man in his 50s welcomed them into his study. "Miss Calloway, I'm delighted to see you well. We were all quite concerned when we heard of your illness." "Thank you, Reverend. I'm feeling much improved." There was an awkward pause before Darius cleared his throat. "Reverend Thomas, we wanted to speak with you about our situation." The minister nodded understandingly. "I gathered that your original plans might have changed." With Darius occasionally adding details, Margaret explained their decision to postpone any wedding plans until they had time to become better acquainted. The Reverend listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. "I commend your prudence," he said when Margaret had finished. "Marriage is indeed a serious commitment, and while your circumstances are unusual, there's wisdom in taking time to be certain of your compatibility." He leaned forward, his gaze direct. "However, I must point out that Miss Calloway's reputation could suffer if the situation is not handled with care. Our community values propriety, even on the frontier." "We're aware of that concern," Darius assured him. "Mrs. Peterson is staying with us as a chaperone for now. But we were hoping you might have suggestions for a more permanent arrangement if Margaret decides to remain in the area during our courtship." Reverend Thomas considered this. "Mrs. Wilson, the schoolteacher, has a spare room she sometimes rents to respectable single women. Her house is just behind the schoolhouse and her reputation is beyond reproach. That might be a suitable arrangement." Margaret looked relieved. "That sounds perfect. Is she in town today? I'd like to speak with her if possible." "I believe she's at the school preparing lessons for Monday." "Shall I accompany you over there?" With the Reverend as their guide, they made their way to the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town. Mrs. Wilson, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, listened to their situation with practical interest. "I do have a room available," she confirmed. "It's small but comfortable. I charge $3 a month, which includes breakfast and supper on school days." "That's very reasonable," Margaret said. "I was also hoping to inquire about employment possibilities. I'm well educated and worked in my father's bookshop for many years. I'm comfortable with accounts, correspondence, and of course, books." Mrs. Wilson's expression brightened. "Actually, I could use an assistant at the school. The number of children has grown considerably this year, and it's becoming difficult to manage all the age groups alone. It wouldn't pay much, just $10 a month, but combined with room and board, it would provide a modest living." Darius watched as Margaret's face lit up with excitement. He felt a mixture of emotions, pride in her initiative and independence, but also a twinge of disappointment that she would not be staying at the ranch. Still, he recognized that this arrangement made sense for both propriety and for giving them the space to make decisions without pressure. "When would you like to move in?" Mrs. Wilson asked. Margaret glanced at Darius before answering. "Perhaps at the end of next week. I'm still regaining my strength and there are a few matters to settle at the ranch first." "That would be fine. I'll have the room ready for you." By the time they left the schoolhouse, the sun was high in the sky. Darius suggested they take lunch at the hotel dining room, the closest thing Julesburg had to a restaurant. As they walked down the main street, Margaret tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, a simple gesture that nonetheless sent a pleasant warmth through him. "Are you disappointed?" she asked quietly. "About my staying in town instead of at the ranch," he considered his answer carefully. "I'll miss seeing you every day," he admitted. "But I understand why this arrangement makes sense, and Julesburg isn't far. I can ride in frequently." She smiled up at him. "I'd like that." The hotel dining room was half full when they entered. Heads turned, curious gazes following them to a small table by the window. Darius was accustomed to being the subject of town gossip as one of the more successful ranchers in the area and a bachelor to boot. His activities had long been fodder for speculation. But he worried about how Margaret would handle the scrutiny. He needn't have concerned himself. Margaret met the curious stares with calm dignity, her posture straight, her manner composed. She engaged their waitress in friendly conversation. asked Darius intelligent questions about the other diners he knew, and generally conducted herself with a grace that soon had people returning to their own meals and conversations. "You handle that well," Darius remarked as they were served their food. "What, the curiosity?" Margaret smiled wryly. "Boston society prepared me for scrutiny, albeit of a different sort. At least here, people are direct in their interest. In Boston, they whisper behind fans and make cutting remarks disguised as compliments. Still, it can't be comfortable." "It isn't," she admitted. "But I understand it. A mail-order bride who arrives sick is nursed back to health by her intended husband and then doesn't immediately marry him." "I'd be curious too." Darius chuckled at her frank assessment. "When you put it that way, I suppose we're providing quite the entertainment." Their meal was pleasant, the food simple but well prepared. As they were finishing, the door to the dining room opened and a well-dressed man entered. He spotted Darius immediately and approached their table with a friendly smile. "Darius Keller, haven't seen you in town for weeks, though I hear you've had your hands full." "Harrison," Darius stood to shake the man's hand. "Margaret, this is Harrison James, owner of the bank and my nearest neighbor to the east. Harrison, Miss Margaret Calloway." "A pleasure to meet you, Miss Calloway. I'm delighted to see you recovered from your illness. My wife sends her regards and hopes you'll join us for dinner once you're fully settled." "That's very kind of her," Margaret replied. "I'd be honored to accept." Harrison turned back to Darius. "Actually, I've been meaning to speak with you about those water rights we discussed last month." "Do you have a moment?" Darius glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead. I'm quite content to sit here and rest for a bit." The men stepped away to a corner of the dining room. Harrison's expression grew serious as soon as they were out of earshot. "Thought you should know, Darius, there's talk about your situation with Miss Calloway." Darius tensed. "What kind of talk?" "Nothing malicious," Harrison assured him quickly. "But people are curious. Some are wondering if your intentions have changed, since there's been no announcement of a wedding. Others are speculating that perhaps the lady found frontier life not to her liking and is planning to return east." "Neither is true," Darius said firmly. "We've simply decided to take some time to become better acquainted before making a lifelong commitment. Margaret will be staying with Mrs. Wilson and working at the school while we court properly." Harrison nodded approvingly. "A sensible approach. I'll make sure Eliza knows the facts. My wife has some influence over the town gossips. She can help ensure the correct version of events circulates." "I'd appreciate that," Darius said sincerely. "Margaret has been through enough with her illness. I don't want her subjected to unfair rumors as well." Harrison clapped him on the shoulder. "Consider it done, and for what it's worth, she seems like a fine woman. Composed, intelligent, exactly the sort you always said you were looking for." "She is," Darius agreed, his gaze drifting back to Margaret, who was calmly sipping her tea by the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating her auburn hair and creating a halo effect that made his heart skip a beat. Harrison followed his gaze and chuckled knowingly. "I'd say you're already more than halfway to knowing your own mind, my friend, courtship or no courtship." By late afternoon, they were on their way back to the ranch. Margaret was noticeably tired, the day's activities having taxed her still recovering strength, but she seemed satisfied with all they had accomplished. "I think it's all working out rather well," she said as the wagon rolled along the rutted road. "Mrs. Wilson seems kind beneath that stern exterior, and teaching assistant is exactly the sort of position I'd hoped for." "You'll be excellent at it," Darius assured her. "Though I wonder if the children of Julesburg are ready for a Boston-educated schoolmarm with progressive ideas." Margaret laughed, a sound that Darius had heard increasingly over the past few days and had come to cherish. "Perhaps not, but they'll adapt as children do. And I'll adapt to them as well." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creaking of the wagon wheels the only sounds. The prairie stretched around them, golden in the late afternoon light, with the distant shapes of Darius's cattle visible on a hillside. "It's beautiful here," Margaret said softly. Different from anything I've known, but beautiful in its own way. There's a vastness to it that makes one feel small, yet not insignificant. Does that make any sense? Perfect sense, Darius replied. That's exactly how I've always felt about this land. It's humbling but also inspiring. Like it's waiting to see what you'll make of yourself and the opportunities it offers. She turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful. You understand it well. I can see why you chose to build your life here. I hope you'll come to love it too, he said, the words emerging before he could consider their implications. Margaret didn't seem to mind. I think I already do, she said simply. The week that followed was one of preparation and adjustment. Margaret continued to regain her strength, taking longer walks each day and helping more around the house. Mrs. Peterson, sensing the developing attachment between Darius and Margaret, gave them space to talk while maintaining her role as chaperone. Darius found himself increasingly drawn to Margaret's company. Her quiet intelligence, her unexpected humor, and her genuine interest in his life and work created a connection he had never expected to find with someone he had initially known only through letters. For her part, Margaret seemed equally comfortable with him. She asked endless questions about ranching, determined to understand this way of life that was so different from her own background. She pored over his mother's old cookbook, practicing recipes in preparation for eventually managing her own household. And she spoke openly of her hopes for the future, which increasingly seemed to include Julesburg and the ranch. The day before Margaret was to move to town, they took a longer ride together, with Mrs. Peterson following at a discreet distance. Darius wanted to show Margaret more of his land, particularly a spot by the creek that had always been special to him. It's where my father and I first camped when we came to survey this property, he explained as they dismounted near a bend in the creek where cottonwood trees provided welcome shade. I was 18, full of dreams about building something of my own. My father believed in those dreams. He helped me stake the claim, build the first cabin. He taught me everything I know about cattle and land management. Margaret listened attentively, hearing not just his words but the emotion behind them. He sounds like a wonderful father. He was, Darius agreed, his throat tight with unexpected emotion. I miss him still. Both my parents. Loss leaves marks on us, Margaret said gently. But so does love. I think the marks left by those who loved us well are the ones that ultimately shape us for the better. Darius looked at her with new appreciation. That's a beautiful way to think of it. They sat on a fallen log near the water's edge, watching the creek flow past. Mrs. Peterson had settled herself with a book under a tree some distance away, providing them privacy while maintaining propriety. I wanted you to see this place, Darius said after a comfortable silence. To understand what this land means to me, it's not just property or a business, it's a legacy, something I hope to build upon and eventually pass on, Margaret nodded, to your children someday. Yes. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. Margaret, I know we agreed to take time to court properly before making decisions about our future, and I still believe that's wise, but I want you to know that my feelings for you have only grown stronger since your arrival. Despite the unusual circumstances, or perhaps because of them, I find myself more certain with each passing day that you are the woman I want to share my life with. She turned to face him, her blue eyes serious yet warm. Darius, you don't need to respond now, he said quickly. I just wanted you to know where I stand. As you prepare to move to town, as we begin this courtship, I wanted to be clear about my intentions and hopes. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her smaller fingers weaving through his. I appreciate your honesty. And I want to be equally honest with you. She paused, gathering her thoughts. When I first agreed to come west as a mail-order bride, I was seeking escape as much as new beginnings. I respected you from your letters, admired your intelligence and integrity, but I didn't know if I could truly love you. I hoped affection and shared purpose might be enough. Darius nodded, understanding this pragmatic approach all too well. It had been his own mindset when placing the advertisement. But these past weeks, Margaret continued, seeing your kindness, your patience, your strength, I've found my feelings changing, deepening. I'm not ready to make promises yet, but I want you to know that when I move to town tomorrow, it's not because I'm uncertain about you. It's because I want to be certain about us, about the life we might build together. Relief and joy washed over Darius. He squeezed her hand gently. That's all I can ask for. On impulse, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against her cheek, a chaste gesture, but one that made his heart race nonetheless. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I think Mrs. Peterson is beginning to look concerned, she murmured, nodding toward their chaperone, who had indeed glanced up from her book with a slight frown. Darius chuckled and stood, helping Margaret to her feet. We should head back. It'll be supper time soon, and you need to finish packing for tomorrow. As they walked back to the horses, Darius felt lighter than he had in weeks. The uncertainty of their situation remained, but it was tempered now by hope and a growing confidence that what had begun as a practical arrangement was blossoming into something far more meaningful. The morning of Margaret's departure for town dawned clear and cool. Darius had hitched the wagon early, loading it with Margaret's trunk, and a few additional items. He insisted she take extra blankets for the coming fall nights, a small rocking chair that had been his mother's, and a basket of late-season vegetables from the garden. You're being very generous, Margaret protested as he added yet another package to the wagon. Just being practical, Darius replied with a small smile. I know Mrs. Wilson provides meals, but a few extras never hurt, Mrs. Peterson, who would be returning to her own home after delivering Margaret to town, watched their interaction with knowing eyes. Over breakfast, she had taken Darius aside and spoken frankly. You two are well suited, she had told him. She has the strength and intelligence needed for frontier life, and you have the patience and steadfastness she needs. Don't let too much time pass before you speak your mind fully. Now, as they prepared to depart, Darius felt the weight of imminent separation. It seemed strange that after just a few weeks, the thought of not seeing Margaret daily could affect him so strongly. I'll ride into town on Saturday, he promised as he helped her into the wagon. Sooner if you need anything. I'll be fine, she assured him, but I'll look forward to Saturday. Their eyes held for a moment, communicating what words could not yet fully express. Then Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat and the moment passed. We should start if we want to reach town before noon, she said practically. Darius stepped back, his hand lingering on Margaret's for a final moment. Safe journey. He watched the wagon until it disappeared from sight, then turned back to the ranch house. It seemed suddenly larger and emptier than before, despite having been his comfortable home for years. Shaking off the melancholy, he set about his day's work. There was always plenty to do on a ranch, and physical labor was the best remedy for troublesome emotions. The days that followed established a new pattern. Darius devoted himself to ranch work, making improvements he had long planned but never prioritized. He built a new chicken coop, repaired fencing in the north pasture, and began planning an expansion to the house, a project that spoke to his hopes for the future. On Saturday, as promised, he rode into Julesburg. He found Margaret settled comfortably in Mrs. Wilson's spare room, which she had already transformed with small touches, a colorful quilt on the bed, a vase of late wildflowers on the dresser, and books arranged neatly on a small shelf. You look well, he said, taking in her healthy color and bright eyes. Town life seems to agree with you. I'm enjoying it, she admitted. Mrs. Wilson is strict but fair, and the children at the school are delightful, most of them anyway. There are a few who test my patience regularly. They walked together down the main street, Margaret proudly showing him the school where she now assisted and introducing him to people she had met. Many greeted her warmly, already accepting her as part of the community. You've made a place for yourself quickly, Darius observed, pleased by how well she was adapting. People have been kind, she said. especially once they understood our situation. Mrs. James Harrison's wife has been particularly welcoming. She's invited me to join her reading circle." They had lunch at the hotel dining room again, this time attracting far less attention than before. Afterward, they visited the small town park, walking slowly among the young trees that had been planted the previous spring. "Tell me about the ranch," Margaret said. "What have you been doing this week?" Darius described his projects, including his plans for expanding the house. Margaret listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions or offering suggestions. When he mentioned adding a small library to the proposed expansion, her eyes lit up. "That would be wonderful, a room just for books and reading." "I thought you'd approve," he said, pleased by her reaction. "It would have good light from east-facing windows and built-in shelves along the north wall." "It sounds perfect," she said softly. They continued walking, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. As the afternoon waned, Darius reluctantly acknowledged that he should return to the ranch before dark. "May I call on you again next Saturday?" he asked. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't," Margaret replied with a smile. "Perhaps we could attend church together on Sunday as well. I'd like that very much." Their courtship proceeded in this manner through the fall weekly visits that gradually increased in frequency as their attachment deepened. Darius found reasons to come to town twice, then 3 times a week. Margaret occasionally accompanied him back to the ranch on Saturday afternoons, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Wilson or other respectable women from town. The seasons changed, the prairie turning from golden to brown as winter approached. The first snow fell in mid-November, transforming the landscape into a sparkling white expanse. Darius worried about the weather making travel between the ranch and town difficult, but he was determined not to let winter separate them completely. On a cold December evening, Julesburg celebrated its annual Christmas social at the schoolhouse. The entire community gathered for music, food, and fellowship. Darius, dressed in his best suit, arrived early to escort Margaret to the event. She looked beautiful in a dark green dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she had arranged in an elegant updo with a few curls framing her face. Darius felt a surge of pride as he offered her his arm, aware of the admiring glances they received as they entered the decorated schoolhouse together. The evening was filled with simple pleasures: shared food, familiar carols sung around the piano, children performing a nativity play under Mrs. Wilson's stern but proud direction. Throughout it all, Darius remained acutely aware of Margaret beside him, her eyes bright with happiness, her hand occasionally finding his. During a quiet moment as they stood near the punch bowl watching the community celebrate, Harrison James approached them. "You two are the talk of the town again," he said with a good-natured chuckle. "But this time it's all positive. Everyone's taking bets on when you'll make your announcement." Margaret blushed, but she didn't pull away when Darius slipped his arm around her waist. "People are getting ahead of themselves," she said, though her tone was light. "Are they?" Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like they're just stating the obvious." After Harrison moved away, Margaret turned to Darius with a questioning look. "Is it that obvious, how we feel about each other?" "I think it might be," Darius admitted. "At least to others. Sometimes I still wonder if I'm reading too much into things, hoping for more than might be there." Margaret's expression softened. "You're not," she said quietly. "I've known my own heart for some time now. I was just waiting for what? For the right moment, for absolute certainty." She took a deep breath. "For courage, perhaps." Darius's heart raced. "And now?" Before she could answer, they were interrupted by the announcement that the children's performance was about to begin. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily for months. Later that night, as the social was winding down, Darius walked Margaret back to Mrs. Wilson's house. Snow had begun to fall again, large flakes drifting lazily in the light of the street lamps. They walked slowly, reluctant for the evening to end. "What you said earlier, Darius began cautiously. About knowing your own heart. Margaret stopped walking and turned to face him, snowflakes catching in her hair and on her eyelashes. Yes, I need to know, Margaret, not for the town's gossip or anyone else's expectations, just for me, for us. How do you feel? What do you want? She looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. I love you, Darius. I think I have for some time now. And what I want is a life with you on the ranch, raising a family, building something meaningful together. Joy surged through him, so powerful it nearly took his breath away. I love you too. More than I knew was possible. These months of courtship have only confirmed what I began to suspect that first week, when I sat beside your sick bed, praying you'd recover. He took her gloved hands in his. I know this isn't the most romantic setting, standing in the snow on Mrs. Wilson's front walk. Margaret laughed softly. I think it's perfectly romantic. Then, Margaret Calloway, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not because of our original arrangement or any sense of obligation, but because we've chosen each other freely and with full hearts? Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I will marry you, Darius Keller. Mindful of their public location, he embraced her gently, pressing a chaste but tender kiss to her lips. It was their first proper kiss, and despite its brevity, it held the promise of a lifetime of love and companionship. They were married on New Year's Day, 1873, in the small white church in Julesburg. The entire town turned out for the occasion, celebrating not just the union of two well-liked residents, but also the romantic story of their unusual courtship. Reverend Thomas performed the ceremony with evident pleasure, noting in his brief sermon how God often worked in mysterious ways, turning challenge and adversity into blessings. After a wedding breakfast at the hotel, attended by their closest friends from town, Darius and Margaret drove back to the ranch through sparkling snow under clear blue skies. The house had been prepared for their arrival, fires lit in the hearth and stove, fresh linens on the bed, and a special supper prepared by Mrs. Langford and left warming in the oven. As Darius carried Margaret across the threshold, a tradition she had insisted upon with a laugh, he felt a profound sense of rightness. This woman who had arrived months ago as a stranger, ill with fever, was now his wife. The journey from that first meeting to this moment had been unexpected, but all the more precious for the challenges they had faced together. Welcome home, Mrs. Keller, he said softly, setting her on her feet in the main room. Margaret's eyes shone as she looked around the familiar space, now transformed by its new significance in her life. It's been home in my heart for some time now, she admitted, but it's wonderful to make it official. The winter passed in a blur of newfound marital happiness. They settled into a rhythm of shared work and companionship, learning each other's habits and preferences, finding joy in the simple daily routines of ranch life. Margaret continued to teach at the school 2 days a week, riding into town with Darius when weather permitted, staying overnight with Mrs. Wilson when necessary. Spring brought new beginnings. The cattle gave birth to healthy calves. The garden Margaret had planned during the winter months began to take shape, and the house expansion Darius had envisioned was underway. The library room was the first section completed, and Margaret filled it with her books from Boston and new volumes ordered from Denver. It was in this room, as summer approached once more, that Margaret shared her most important news with Darius. I have something to tell you, she said one evening as they sat together, reading by the light of an oil lamp. Something wonderful. Darius looked up from his book, noting the special glow in her eyes. What is it? We're going to have a baby, she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. In late December or early January, according to Mrs. Langford. Darius set his book aside and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. A baby, are you certain? Mrs. Langford confirms it. I've suspected for a few weeks now. Joy and concern battled within him. Are you well? Is there anything you need? Should you stop teaching? Margaret laughed at his rush of questions. I'm perfectly well. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, you know, and Mrs. Langford says I can continue teaching until the fall term ends as long as I rest properly. Darius placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, wonder filling him at the thought of their child growing within her. A baby, he repeated, the reality slowly sinking in. Our baby. The beginning of our family, Margaret said softly, the legacy you spoke of passing on. He looked up at her, overwhelmed with love for this remarkable woman who had traveled across a continent to find him, who had fought through illness and uncertainty to build a life with him, and who was now carrying their child. I love you, Margaret, more than I can ever express. I know, she said simply, her hand covering his on her stomach. And I love you. The months that followed were filled with preparations. The house expansion was completed with renewed urgency, including a nursery adjacent to their bedroom. Margaret sewed tiny garments and quilts, while Darius crafted a cradle from cherry wood harvested from their own small orchard. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed, Darius found himself increasingly protective, insisting on accompanying her whenever she went to town, hiring extra help for the ranch so he could be more available to her, and constantly checking that she wasn't overexerting herself. You're hovering, my love, Margaret told him with fond exasperation one October afternoon as he insisted on carrying a basket of apples she had been perfectly capable of managing. I'm pregnant, not invalided. I just want to take care of you both, he replied, unrepentant. Indulge me. She softened, reaching up to touch his cheek. I do appreciate your concern, but remember that frontier women have been having babies under far more challenging circumstances than mine for generations. I'm healthy, the baby is active and misses. Langford says everything is progressing exactly as it should. When the first snow fell in November, Darius began making preparations for the birth. He arranged for Mrs. Langford to stay at the ranch when Margaret's time came, stocked extra supplies in case winter storms made travel to town impossible, and made sure the doctor in Sterling knew to come immediately if sent for. You've thought of everything, Margaret remarked as she watched him checking the emergency supplies for the third time that week. Except perhaps how to remain calm when the time comes, Darius smiled ruefully. That might be beyond my capabilities. The baby, however, had plans of its own. 2 weeks before Christmas, in the middle of a clear, cold night, Margaret woke Darius with a hand on his shoulder. It's time, she said simply, her voice steady despite the pain he could see in her eyes. The hours that followed tested both their strength and resolve. Mrs. Langford arrived quickly, having anticipated the call and prepared herself to come at any hour. She took charge of the situation with calm efficiency, directing Darius to heat water and prepare the bedroom while she examined Margaret. Everything is progressing normally, she assured them both. But first babies often take their time. It could be many hours yet. Those hours stretched into a full day and night. Margaret faced the pain of labor with the same quiet determination she had shown in fighting the fever that had nearly claimed her life when she first arrived. Darius remained by her side throughout, holding her hand, bathing her forehead with cool cloths, a role reversal that wasn't lost on either of them. You cooled my brow when I first came to you, Margaret murmured during a brief respite between contractions. Now you're doing it again. And I'll continue doing it for as long as you need me to, he promised, pressing a kiss to her damp hair. As dawn broke on the second day, Margaret's labor intensified. Mrs. Langford's expression grew more focused, her instructions more precise. It won't be long now, she told them. The baby is coming. With a final, tremendous effort that left Darius in awe of his wife's strength, Margaret brought their child into the world, a healthy boy with a strong cry and his mother's blue eyes. A son, Darius whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as Mrs. Langford placed the swaddled infant in Margaret's arms. We have a son. Margaret looked up at him, exhaustion and joy mingling in her expression. He's perfect. What shall we call him? They had discussed names but hadn't settled on any definite choices. Now, looking at his son's face, Darius knew exactly the right name. Thomas, he said. After my father, if that's all right with you, Thomas Keller, Margaret repeated softly, tracing a gentle finger along their son's cheek. It's perfect. Hello, Thomas, we've been waiting for you, as Mrs. Langford discreetly busied herself with cleaning up. Darius sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Margaret, gazing down at their son. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been unexpected in every way, beginning with a fever and fear, transforming into friendship and love, and now culminating in this new life they had created together. I never imagined, Darius said quietly, when I sent for a mail-order bride, that I would find not just a wife but a true partner, someone who would change my life so completely. Margaret leaned against him, cradling their son. Nor did I imagine, when I agreed to marry a stranger in a distant territory, that I would find such happiness. It seems we both got more than we bargained for. Much more, he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. And I wouldn't change a moment of it, not even the fever that delayed our wedding. Especially not the fever, Margaret said with a soft laugh. Without it, we might have married immediately as strangers bound by a practical arrangement. Instead, we had the chance to truly know each other, to choose each other deliberately and with full hearts. Darius nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. From uncertainty came certainty. From illness came health. From practicality came love. As the winter sun rose higher, bathing the room in golden light, they sat together in peaceful contentment, a family created not by convention or convenience, but by choice and cherished through challenge. Their story had begun with a fever and a cowboy's gentle care. It would continue through all the seasons of their lives, growing richer and deeper with each passing year.